if I was going to take the perspective that, hey, our company was going to have majority of Gen Z employees or a growing number of Gen Z employees, that we have to think about their kind of psyche as they enter the workforce and what that means. The first thing I would think about is like, how do you catch up that development? If they're underdeveloped in this area, how do you catch them up? And I got to think the best way is in-person work. Welcome to the Wellable Weekly podcast, where we talk about key topics and trends at the intersection of well-being, technology, and HR. We are a weekly podcast, as everyone knows, and all of our avid listeners are probably wondering why we missed last week's episode. Unfortunately, we had a loss in the family, so Geoff's grandmother passed away, and so I figured it should be a good opportunity for us just to celebrate her life briefly.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to do that. Grandma Gina, or Gma, as we called her affectionately, kind of the matriarch of our family, 95 years old, just a few days shy of her 96th birthday. So certainly a sad time for us, but again, lived a great long life and was lucky to be her grandson.
Yeah, I'm sorry for your loss. I mean, I know I've only met her once, and for those of you who don't know, Geoff and I literally work across the desk from each other, so like we're deeply in tune with each other's personal lives in many ways. And the only time I met her was at your wedding, and I met her outside very briefly. We chatted. Everything you've told me about her, she lived up to instantly in that short conversation. And then, I was with my wife, went to like the bar or something. I came back to the barn to go to the dance floor, and she was like in the center of the mix, dancing it up. I think she was like 94 at the time, or 95. And so
Right.
I just, in my mind, I go, that's perfectly emblematic of everything I knew about her, and confirmed that short piece. So sorry for your loss, but she sounds like she lived a full life. I know just from my conversation with you that she had a huge impact on a ton of the people that um, she was close to.
Absolutely. Yeah, well said.
So because we missed a week, we're going to cover two articles kind of in short form, because 2 weeks ago, the Wellable Weekly newsletter had a great article on Gen Z, and really the headline was very specific, but I think it probably reflects just a broader topic we're talking about. But the headline was something along the lines of Gen Z are dating less, and that is making it very hard for them to operate in the workforce. So the first thing I thought of was like, what exactly is a cutoff for Gen Z? I always ask this because I'm like a millennial, and I'm thinking like, what am I? And so I'm like an old millennial. I know it's like not the fact that you're a millennial and you all of a sudden fall into this pattern, but the deeper you get into that generation, the more those kind of like stereotypes, for lack of a better term, uh, demonstrate or like represent themselves. So I think the technical definition of a Gen Z is 1996. If you're born in 1996 or later, or not later, or I think to 2012, you're Gen Z. So in terms of the workforce, anyone 96 and after is a Gen Zer. So that makes, maybe the oldest Gen Z, like around like maybe turning 30 years right now. So older than you thought. I thought like a Gen Z was like a 25-year-old. But so the reason I mentioned that is it's a substantial portion of the workforce, and it's a growing portion of the workforce. And they're dating less just makes it, per the article, really difficult for them to understand the social etiquette maybe required in the workforce. And so the stat that's the kind of the key takeaway of the article is that 50%, 56% of Gen Zs have never engaged in a romantic relationship, right? And just for comparison purposes, that's about 75% of the members of other generations, right? And so that's pretty substantial difference.
Yeah. Well, first, I completely relate to how you anchor into perceptions of generations based on what you may have thought years ago, right? So again, to me, a 29 or 30-year-old, like that's a millennial, right? But no, to your point, that's really now an older member of Gen Z. And your comment around the significance of this topic and why Gen Z is such an important generation. We read a stat that Gen Z is going to represent 30% of the U.S. workforce by 2030. So 50 million people are in this generation that what we're talking about today. And agreed, the headline is interesting, right? And the obvious thought is, well, what does dating necessarily have to do with the workplace and workforce productivity and things like that? But I kind of interpreted the article as relationships of all kind, right? Whether it's romantic, platonic friendships. It's all about the same type of thing. It's communication, it's compromise, it's giving and taking. And if we know that Gen Z is dating less, we also know that they're socializing less, right? We know that they're, talked about this in our first podcast, less drinking, right? Less happy hours, and just having general less face-to-face interaction than any prior generation. There's obviously a few reasons for that, right? You've got the pandemic era, you've got the era of social media, but bottom line is, you have a situation where this entire generation is just being exposed to less and less of some of those like foundational experiences and skill sets that probably shaped our generation, millennials.
Yeah, in summary, it's relationships are hard, right? I always think about this when I have friends like, or even some coworkers who are younger getting married. If I ever get asked for advice, I just say, relationships are hard, and if they weren't, they're probably not that meaningful. So I personally have had hard moments in my relationships with my best friends. So it doesn't necessarily need to be like a romantic thing necessarily, but to your point, they're just less social and have less of these interactions. And so in the workplace, you're going to have disagreements with people, right? And it doesn't matter if like you have a personal relationship with them or not. Like it is a formal relationship you have with the individual. It's someone that you're not just going to be able to shut out of your life, right? That's the idea of like a romantic relationship or a really close friend is that, you can have a fight with them, but the next day you see them at school or you interact with them and you have to continue to do so. And working through those hard relationships, be able to articulate yourself, express yourself in ways that may be hard to understand or topics that are difficult to discuss is like a skill, like everything, and you have to develop it. And effectively, this generation is just underdeveloped in that area. More broadly, to your point about socializing and drinking, I just think like every stat I read on Gen Z, and I feel like this is a classic example of like an older generation, like kind of like, looking down upon a younger generation, but it's it's just the risk off, right? And in any type of professional setting, even like academia, you have to be to a certain degree risk on, right? If you're a scientist, you're constantly taking risks in experimentation and trying to learn something. If you're in sales, you're taking risks in how you talk and pitch your business or what you're trying to sell. Whatever you're doing, there's a certain amount of risk taking. And like driving a car, that's another thing that Gen Z does at a lower level, mostly because, when I was 16, I couldn't wait to get behind a steering wheel because I wanted to go see all my friends. I wanted the freedom to go do all these things. And when you don't really have that desire to go socialize or be able to explore the world, you don't really need a car. And as a result, you drive less, and driving is a risky behavior. And driving, in addition to teaching you how to drive and learn how to engage with the road, it teaches you just broader life skills. And I think some of that, per this article, is lacking in the workforce.
Right. And this is just, kind of a story I hear from a few different younger friends and coworkers who are in this generation, that the approach nowadays when you might be out with friends or looking to meet some new folks is, if you're at a bar and you maybe see somebody that you might want to strike up a conversation with, rather than just going over and approaching them, first instinct would be to pull up dating apps and see if they're on those apps. And if they are, it might be a good sign that they would be more receptive to having a conversation. If they're not, it might be a sign that might not go over and talk to that person because they might not be on the app. So or they might not be interested in chatting with me. So I guess on the one hand, you could view that as like, it's a very conservative, overly maybe cautious approach to just having a conversation that could go nowhere or it could go somewhere. But I think it's very much on that risk off mindset that is, protecting from failure, protecting from rejection or harm. And that approach, whether it's in a restaurant or a bar or elsewhere, it feels like that's spilling over into the workplace and all the challenging things that make work hard, right? In some ways, whether it's having a tough conversation with a boss or a peer or a client, all those things come with some stress, some pressure, and some potential for letdown or rejection.
Your bar story is just such a foreign concept to me. I mean, partially because like I wasn't like on the dating apps a ton or things like that, but like I just don't see how that's effective. Like if you're in a city like Boston, like what's the odds you find that person, right? Like they very well could be single and all these things, and like there's always like a risk reward. Like how much time are you going to spend in the corner of the bar searching to see if there's one person is on this app versus like the 5 minutes it takes to just to find out. That being said, like, what do you do with this? If you're an employer, how do you react to this data? And it's an interesting question. Like, I got to think this is a polarizing comment, just because return to office and remote work just is a topic that just has a very opinionated uh, views on both sides. But like in my mind, if I was going to take the perspective that, hey, our company was going to have majority of Gen Z employees or a growing number of Gen Z employees, that we have to think about their kind of psyche as they enter the workforce and what that means. The first thing I would think about is like, how do you catch up that development? If they're underdeveloped in this area, how do you catch them up? And I got to think the best way is in-person work, right? Because if you're working remotely, again, you have this big divide. Like, you're just on Teams, you're on Zoom. Maybe you're not even doing video. A lot of companies don't require video when they're talking to their employees, or requiring employees talk to each other. And that just strikes me as like, maybe you can develop those skill sets there. I got to think it's hard, but it certainly happens quicker in person. Because if you just, part of that relationship piece is you have to interact with people you don't always like. It's easy to do, if have interactions with people you get along with. The hard part is interacting with people who you don't like, or getting along with people who you do like but just are not jiving with at that given time or day. And you just can't like walk out of the office and escape that necessarily. But in Teams, you can like not respond to a message, put yourself as do not disturb. Like, you can very easily create barriers. And so I don't know. I'm kind of guessing here. So I would think the solution to that, including the solution to workplace loneliness, which is a completely separate topic we can talk about later,
Totally.
is on-site work, or in-office work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of connection points between you know relationship building and loneliness, and whether you're working fully or mostly remote versus coming into an office. Or even, again, we talked about organizational policies around in-office work and how companies can make that meaningful. If you're being asked to come into an office, but your team's not there, or you're not having meaningful interactions, then you're not getting the benefit out of it. So certainly there's something to be said for the employer doing their part as well. But I have to think that that's such a obvious way to address some of these challenges that the Gen Z workforce is facing, again, coming up in that kind of COVID pandemic era and facing new workforce arrangements unlike any other generation had to go through.
Agreed. One last kind of maybe comment on it. I would say, as one from one generation to the other, if I had to give advice to individuals, like not the employer, just the individuals of the Gen Zers, I'd probably say something along the lines of saying it's a skill, right? And whether you're developed at it or not, like, you can always get better, myself included. Like, I can always get better at my, improving the relationships that I have. But it's because it's a skill, it's hard to develop and it requires work. So if you want to develop that, and if you're aware of like some of these deficiencies that exist within yourselves, you're going to have to go through, some challenging times as you expose yourself and put yourself in situations where you're growing. And that difficult moment is just the, part and parcel what's required to grow. So, um, on that note, we can maybe move on to the next topic here. The difficult time, I guess the best way is to segue this, right? I would probably call it economic malaise. In the Wellable Weekly newsletter, we put one article, but there's just like a whole set of articles around this topic that full of data points that just kind of highlight what I would call like just general frustration, fear, concern in the economic environment that employees are operating in today. The stat that was actually in the newsletter was from ZipRecruiter. It's an article that 27% of people who just got new jobs took a pay cut. So that means they left their old job, got a new one, and now are getting paid less. I think 16% of people got paid the same. So, you could, other side of the coin is that the majority of people got paid more. I think the reason it's a concern is like the vast majority of people, if not, almost nearly all people, leave jobs and get paid more. So this number, even though it's less than 50%, is substantially higher. And that's just a general point of concern. But I think if you dive into other stats around it, like there's this global survey from ADP, they had like 20%, 28% of US workers would agree that they feel safe in their current job. And like that's, I mean, that's three-fourths of people don't feel safe in their current job. Some of that may be just general economic environment. Some of that could be AI, who knows? But that's a very, very high number. in general for job growth, I think 2025, the latest numbers, and they could be revised again, are 116,000 net or new jobs created, but effectively the net new jobs is zero. It's like pretty much no new jobs were created in 2025. No sign that that's really changing in 2026. So you imagine that's getting people concerned. I can go on and on and on. There's just so many statistics that just represent the anxiety that people may have in the economic environment that we're operating in.
Right. I mean, so the ones you mentioned there, you have low or no overall net job growth. You have a large percentage of employed workers who are not feeling like their job is safe. And those who are seeking or actually making a change, a good percentage, almost a quarter of them, are not seeing an increase in pay. I mean, those are three pretty staggering statistics. And I mean, the last one around making a transition and not necessarily seeing a pay bump, I mean, that was something that was almost kind of taken for granted, especially I would say in like that, tech or, extended knowledge worker industries, where that was the most natural way where you could get a bump or, take that next step would be to, go elsewhere, in your field. And you had, many, but in some cases, many opportunities to take that next step, but clearly, not the case. And some other kind of related stats that we found in this, Gallup report is just around like this concept of employees who are thriving versus struggling. And there's a really, interesting chart, and we'll put it up in the YouTube video, that shows the convergence of those for really the first time since Gallup's been tracking this life evaluation index, where there is a higher percentage of employees who feel like they are struggling versus those who are actually thriving. And you think about what that means, right, for your average employer or just the job market as a whole. People who are not thriving, who are struggling, more likely to miss work. They might be looking for a new job and obviously struggling to find one. They might be, getting sick more often. They have health problems and just probably lower overall engagement.
Yeah, I always see like an article like this because I actually was the one who's like, this is the one we have to talk about, right, in the podcast. And typically we try to choose one that's interesting, but also Geoff and I have like a hot take on. And this one's like really tough because like, one is like kind of bummer news, right? A lot of negative news about the economy, but also I don't know what really to say other than the like, generic feedback is like employees have to upskill and AI is going to require a new set of skills to be successful. So what was successful even 5 years ago is not the necessarily the skills that would be successful today. I think those are all true, but they're also kind of like very obvious. And so the only thing I can really kind of try to like tie a ribbon around all this stuff is more along the lines of like how do you try to take the positive in some cases. If you are looking for a job, and I think the current stats like half of employees are actively seeking or like watching like new jobs and are looking down their current situation, is that for the majority of them, if they land a new job, they will get a pay raise, right? If you count the people who end up in the exact same pay situation, it's like, pretty significant portion of people will be at the same level or higher, which is, one way to frame it's better. I think also I always tell people when they think about leaving for jobs, like one, figure out why are you leaving, like run towards something, not away from something. Like if you don't like your current job, that's completely fine. But like figure out where you want to go. Because if your answer is like, I just need to leave this job, you end up in places that aren't great. And there are places and great outcomes for people where maybe you do take a job cut or pay cut, but you're in a way better place and a way happier situation. And that's a win, right? Pay cut aside, that's a winning situation. And so really discover what are you trying to run toward, and then making sure you have the skills and the competency to be successful in that domain.
Yeah, that's probably a good place to wrap on. I mean, I think the upskilling is something that always is relevant probably now more so than ever. And agreed. Even though the job sentiment, the fact that it might not be the best time to look for a new job. It may be a time to look internally and figure out what new skills you can personally develop, and hopefully apply those to enrich the experience you have at your current employer. Well, thanks again for listening to this week's edition to Wellable Weekly. As always, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to check out our Wellable Weekly newsletter and follow us on LinkedIn. Until next time.